when the power of both the traditionalists and the modernizers was thoroughly shattered by superior force, the great majority of Asians and Africans accepted imperial rule. Political participation in non-Western lands was historically limited to small elites, and the masses were used to doing what their rulers told them. In these circumstances, Europeans, clothed in power and convinced of their righteousness, governed smoothly and effectively. They received considerable support from both traditionalists, local chiefs, landowners, religious leaders, and modernizers, Western-educated professional classes, and civil servants. Nevertheless, imperial rule was in many ways an imposing edifice built on sand. Support for European rule among the conforming and accepting millions was shallow and weak. Thus, the conforming masses followed, with greater or lesser enthusiasm, a few determined personalities who came to oppose the Europeans. Such leaders always arose, both when Europeans ruled directly and when they manipulated native governments, for at least two basic reasons. First, the nonconformists, the eventual anti-imperialist leaders, developed a burning desire for Hutire, man dignity. They came to feel that such dignity was incompatible with foreign rule, with its smirks and smiles, its paternalism and condescension. Second, potential leaders found in the Western world the ideologies and justification for their protest. They discovered liberalism, with its credo of civil liberty and political self-determination. They echoed the demands of anti-imperialists in Europe and America that the West live up to its own ideals. Above all, they found themselves attracted to modern nationalism, which asserted that every people had the right to control its own destiny. After 1917, anti-imperialist revolt would find another weapon in Lenin's version of Marxian socialism. Thus, the anti-imperialist search for dignity drew strength from Western culture, as is apparent in the development of three major Asian countries: India, Japan, and China. Empire in India. India was the jewel of the British Empire, and no colonial area experienced a more profound British impact. Unlike Japan and China, which maintained a real or precarious independence, and unlike African territories, which were annexed by Europeans only at the end of responses to Western imperialism 881 the 19th century, India was ruled more or less absolutely by Britain for a very long time. Arriving in India on the heels of the Portuguese in the 17th century, the British East India Company had conquered the last independent native state by 1848. The last traditional response to European rule, the attempt by the established ruling classes to drive the white man out by military force, was broken in India in 1857 and 1858. Those were the years of the Great Rebellion, which the British called a mutiny, when an insurrection by Muslim and Hindu mercenaries in the British Army spread throughout northern and central India before it was finally crushed, primarily by loyal native troops from southern India. Thereafter, Britain ruled India directly. India illustrates, therefore, for better and for worse, what generations of European domination might produce. After 1858, India was ruled by the British Parliament in London and administered by a tiny, all-white civil service in India. In 1900, this elite consisted of fewer than 3,500 top officials, for a population of 300 lion. The white elite, backed by white officers and native troops, was competent and generally well-disposed toward the welfare of the Indian peasant masses. Yet it practiced strict job discrimination and social segregation, and most of its members, quite frankly, considered the jumble of Indian peoples and castes to be racially inferior. As Lord Kitchener, one of the most distinguished top military commanders in India, stated, "It is this consciousness of the inherent superiority of the European which has won for us India. However well-educated and clever a native may be, and however brave he may prove himself, I believe that no rank we can bestow on him would cause him to be considered an equal of the British officer." 16. When, for example, the British Parliament in 1883 was considering a major bill to allow Indian judges to try white Europeans in India, the British community rose in protest and defeated the measure. The idea of being judged by Indians was inconceivable to the Europeans, for it was clear to them that the empire in India rested squarely on racial inequality. In spite of, or perhaps even because of, their strong feelings of racial and cultural superiority, the British acted energetically and introduced many desirable changes to India. Realizing that they needed well-educated Indians to serve as skilled subordinates in the government and army, the British established a modern system of progressive secondary education in which all instruction was in English. Thus, through education and government service, the British offered some Indians excellent opportunities for both economic and social advancement. High-caste Hindus, particularly quick to respond, emerged as skillful intermediaries between the British rulers and the Indian people, and soon they formed a new elite profoundly influenced by Western thought and culture. This new bureaucratic elite played a crucial role in modern economic development, which was a second result of British rule. Irrigation projects for agriculture, the world's third largest railroad network for good communications, and large tea and jute plantations geared to the world economy were all developed. Unfortunately, the lot of the Indian masses improved little, for the increase in production was eaten up by population increase. Finally, with a well-educated English-speaking Indian bureaucracy and modern communications, the British created a unified, powerful state. They placed under the same general system of law and administration the different Hindu and Muslim peoples, and the vanquished kingdoms of the entire subcontinent, groups that had fought each other for centuries during the Middle Ages and had been repeatedly conquered by Muslim and Mongol invaders. It was as if Europe, with its many states and varieties of Christianity, had been conquered and united in a single great empire. In spite of these achievements, the decisive reaction to European rule was the rise of nationalism among the Indian elite. No matter how anglicized and necessary a member of the educated classes became, he or she could never become the white ruler's equal. The top jobs, the best clubs, the modern hotels, and even certain railroad compartments were sealed off to brown-skinned men and women. The peasant masses might accept such inequality as the latest version of age-old oppression, but the well-educated, English-speaking elite eventually could not. For the elite, racial discrimination meant not only injured pride, but also bitter injustice. It flagrantly contradicted the example of Japan. When Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan in 1853 with his crude but effective gunboat diplomacy, Japan was a complex feudal society. At the top stood a figurehead emperor, but for more than 200 years, real power had been in the hands of a hereditary military governor, the shogun. With the help of a warrior nobility known as samurai, the shogun governed a country of hard-working, productive peasants and city dwellers. Often poor and restless, the intensely proud samurai were humiliated by the sudden American intrusion and the unequal treaties with Western countries. When foreign diplomats and merchants began to settle in Yokohama, radical samurai reacted with a wave of anti-foreign terrorism and anti-government assassinations between 1858 and 1863. The imperialist response was swift and unambiguous. An allied fleet of American, British, Dutch, and French warships demolished key forts, further weakening the power and prestige of the shogun's government. Then, in 1867, a coalition led by patriotic samurai seized control of the government with hardly any bloodshed and restored the political power of the emperor. This was the Meiji Restoration, a great turning point in Japanese development. The immediate, all-important goal of the new government was to meet the foreign threat. The battle cry of the Meiji reformers was, "Enrich the state." They decreed freedom of movement in a country where traveling abroad had been a most serious crime. They created a free, competitive, government-stimulated economy. Japan began to build railroads and modern factories. Thus, the new generation adopted many principles of a free, liberal society. And as in Europe, such freedom resulted in a tremendously creative release of human energy. Yet the overriding concern of Japan's political leadership was always a powerful state, and to achieve this, more than liberalism was borrowed from the West. A powerful modern navy was created, and the army was completely reorganized along French and German lines, with 3-year military service for all males and a professional officer corps. See the feature, Listening to the Past, a Japanese plan for a modern army, on pages 888, 889. This army of draftees effectively an ancient love of country to transform itself and thereby meet the many-sided challenge of Western expansion. Moreover, Japan demonstrated convincingly that a modern Asian nation could defeat and humble a great Western power. Many Chinese nationalists were fascinated by Japan's achievement. A group of patriots in French-ruled southern Vietnam sent Vietnamese students to Japan to learn the island empire's secret of success. Japan provided patriots throughout Asia and Africa with an inspiring example of national recovery and liberation. Toward revolution in China. In 1860, the 200-year-old Manchu dynasty in China appeared on the verge of collapse. Efforts to repel foreigners had failed, and rebellion and chaos racked the country. Yet the government drew on its traditional strengths and made a surprising comeback that lasted more than 30 years. Two factors were crucial in this reversal, with foreign missionaries, whom they charged with undermining reverence for ancestors, and thereby threatening the Chinese family and the entire society. In the agony of defeat and unwanted reforms, secret societies such as the Boxers rebelled. In northeastern China, more than 200 foreign missionaries and several thousand Chinese Christians were killed. Once again, the imperialist response was swift and harsh. Peking was occupied and plundered by foreign armies. A heavy indemnity was imposed. The years after the Boxer Rebellion, 1900 to 1903, were ever more troubled. Anarchy and foreign influence spread as the power and prestige of the Manchu dynasty declined still further. Anti-foreign, anti-government revolutionary groups agitated and plotted. Finally, in 1912, a spontaneous uprising toppled the Manchu dynasty. After thousands of years of emperors and empires, a loose coalition of revolutionaries proclaimed a Western-style republic and called for an elected parliament. The transformation of China under the impact of expanding Western society entered a new phase, and to their international isolation. And the alliance lasted 20 years. Russo-Japanese rivalry. War between Japan and Russia broke out in 1904, beginning with a Japanese naval attack on Russian installations at Port Arthur. Both sides sent large armies into Manchuria. The decisive Battle of Mukden, which was fought for control of the important Manchurian city, now called Shenyang, engaged more troops than any previous battle in human history, 624,000 men. Military observers were present from all the major powers, anxiously trying to learn what the next war in Europe might be like. The Russians sent their Baltic fleet around 3 continents to the Far East, but to the world's amazement, the Russian fleet was met and destroyed at Tsushima Strait by the new and untested Navy of Japan. Russian communications by sea were thereby broken, and because the Trans-Siberian Railway was unfinished, and because the Japanese also won the Battle of Mukden, Russia was beaten. At this point, the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, stepped upon the scene. With a new colonial outpost in the Philippines and a growing interest in China, it was to the American advantage to have neither side win too overwhelming a victory in the Far East. The most imperially minded of all American presidents offered his mediation, and plenipotentiaries of the two powers met at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. 1235, by the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, Japan recovered from Russia what it had won and lost in 1895, namely Port Arthur and the Liaotung Peninsula, a preferred position in Manchuria, which Cixent99 remained nominally Chinese, and a protectorate in Korea, which remained nominally independent until it was annexed by Japan in 1910. Japan also received from Russia the southern half of the island of Sakhalin. Much of what Russia lost to Japan in 1905 was regained 40 years later at heard of it throughout the non-European world. The fact that Japan was itself an imperialist power was overlooked in the excited realization that the Japanese people were gaining the kind of international power and influence that had long given the European nations an apparently unstoppable ascendancy. Only half a century earlier, the Japanese, too, had been deemed backward, defenseless, bombarded, and bulldozed by the Europeans. Now Japan had achieved the status of a great power that could sign military alliances with Great Britain and defeat the armed forces of the Russian Empire. 1237. Consequences of Japanese victory. The moral was clear. Everywhere, leaders of subjugated peoples concluded, from the Japanese precedent, that they must bring European science and industry to their own countries. but that they must do it, as the Japanese had done, by ending European political control of Asian or African colonies, supervising the process of modernization themselves, and preserving their own distinctive cultures. New, hybrid elites in colonized societies combined their growing knowledge of European culture with a growing pride in their own cultural traditions, thereby creating the new nationalisms that would become a major worldwide legacy of modern European imperialism. Nationalist revolutions began in Persia in 1905, in Turkey in 1908, in China in 1911. In India and Indonesia, many were stirred by the Japanese achievement. In the face of rising agitation, the British admitted an Indian to the Viceroy's Council in 1909, and in 1916, the Dutch created a People's Council to include Indonesian members in the Dutch East Indies. The self-assertion of Asians was to grow in intensity after the First World War, when the limits of European power became increasingly evident. The Japanese victory and Russian defeat can, therefore, be seen as starting points for three mighty developments: the First World War, the Russian Revolution, and the revolt of Asia against European imperialism. These far-reaching upheavals all contributed to the weakening of Europe's influence in modern global history. They gradually put an end to Europe's global ascendancy and undermined confident ideas about the inevitable progress and expansion of European civilization. Each of these transitional events would alter Europe's long dominant international position and help to make the world of the 20th century far different from that of the 19th. But Europeans could not have imagined in 1905 that the Russo-J